Plea to the Foreigner by Ambedkar. 7. The facts set out above prove beyond cavil that the fight for freedom launched by the Congress has ended in perverting the aim and object of Indian freedom, and that the Congress itself is a party to such a perversion. The result is an enormity, a character of which it would not be possible for the foreigner to realize unless he has an adequate idea of the social outlook and social philosophy of the governing classes of India. Starting with the Brahmins, who form a strong and powerful element in the governing class in India, it is no exaggeration to say that they have been the most inveterate enemies of the servile classes, the Shudras, the old name for the non-Brahmins, and the untouchables, who together constitute about 80 or 90% of the total Hindu population of India. If the common man belonging to the servile classes in India is today so fallen, so degraded, so devoid of self-respect, hope or ambition, and so lifeless, it is entirely due to the Brahmins and their philosophy. The cardinal principles of this philosophy of the Brahmins were six, to use a correct expression, techniques of suppression. 1. Graded inequality between the different classes. 2. Complete disarmament of the Shudras and the untouchables. 3. Complete ban on the education of the Shudras and the untouchables. 4. Total exclusion of the Shudras and the untouchables from places of power and authority. And 5. Complete prohibition against the Shudras and untouchables acquiring property. And 6. Complete subjugation and suppression of women. Inequality is the official doctrine of Brahmanism, and the suppression of the lower classes aspiring to equality has been looked upon by them and carried out by them without remorse as their bounden duty. Where education did not spread beyond a few, but India is the only country where the intellectual class, namely the Brahmins, not only made education their monopoly, but declared acquisition of education by the lower classes a crime punishable by cutting off of the tongue or by the pouring of molten lead in the air of the offender. The result is that for centuries the Brahmins have denied the servile classes the right to education. Even today, the Brahmins exhibit the same hostility to their education. Mr. Benz, the Census Commissioner for 1891, in discussing the causes why education was not spreading among the masses, said, "The second influence antagonistic to a more general spread of literacy is the long-continued existence of a hereditary class whose object has been to maintain their own monopoly of all book learning as the chief buttress of their social supremacy. Sacerdotalism knows that it can reign over none but an ignorant populace. The opposition of the Brahmin to the rise of the writer castes have been already mentioned, and the repugnance of both in the present day to the diffusion of learning amongst the masses can only be appreciated after a long experience. It is true that by the recognition of the British government of the virtue and necessity of primary education, it is met with some response on part of the literary castes, but it is chiefly in the direction of academic utterances, which cannot in circumstances be well avoided. It is welcome too in its capacity of affording the means of livelihood to many of these castes, as they have to be engaged as teachers and are bound accordingly to work up to the state standard of efficient tuition. The real interests of the castes in question is centered on secondary education, of which they almost exclusively are in a position to reap the advantage. The Congress politicians complain that the British are ruling India by a wholesale disarmament of the people of India. But they forget the disarmament of the Shudras and the untouchables was the rule of law promulgated by the Brahmins. Indeed, so strongly did the Brahmins believe in the disarmament of the Shudras and the untouchables that when they devised the law to enable the Brahmins to arm themselves for the protection of their own privileges, they maintained the ban of the Shudras and the untouchables as it was without lessening its rigor. If the large majority of people of India appear today to be thoroughly emasculated, spiritless, with no manliness, it is the result of the Brahminic policy of wholesale disarmament to which they have been subjected for the untold ages. There is no social evil and no social wrong to which the Brahmin has not given his support. Man's inhumanity to man, such as the feeling of caste, untouchability, unapproachability, and unseeability, is a religion to him. It would, however, be a mistake to suppose that only the wrongs of man are a religion to him. The Brahmin has given his support to some of the worst wrongs that women have suffered from in any part of the world. In India, widows were burnt alive as satis, and the Brahmins gave his full support to the practice. Widows were not allowed to remarry. The Brahmins uphold the doctrine. Girls were required to be married before 8, and the husbands were permitted to claim the right to consummate the marriage at any time thereafter, whether she had reached puberty or not. The Brahmin defended the system. The record of the Brahmins as lawgivers for the Shudras and for the untouchables and for the women is the blackest as compared with the record of the intellectual classes in other parts of the world, for no intellectual class has prostituted its intelligence for the sole purpose of inventing a philosophy to keep his uneducated countrymen in a perpetual state of servility, ignorance, and poverty as the Brahmins and their philosophy has done in India. Every Brahmin today believes in this prophecy of Brahmanism propounded by his forefathers. He is an alien element in the Hindu society. The Brahmin vis-a-vis the Shudras and the untouchables is as foreign as the German is to the Jew is to the Gentile, or as the white is to the black. There is a real gulf between him and the lower classes, the Shudras and the untouchables. He is not only alien to them, but he is also hostile to them. In relationship with them, there is in him no room for conscience and no call for justice. The Banya is the worst parasitic class known to history. In him, the vice of money making is unredeemed by culture or conscience. He is like an undertaker who prospers when there is an epidemic. The only difference between the undertaker and the Banya is that the undertaker does not create an epidemic, while the Banya does. He does not use his money for productive purposes. He uses it to create poverty and more poverty by lending money for unproductive purposes. He lives on interest, and as he is told by his religion that money lending is the occupation prescribed to him by the divine Manu, upon money lending is both right and righteous. With the help and assistance of the Brahmin judge who is ready to decree his suits, the Banya is able to carry on his trade with the greatest ease. Interest on interest, he adds on, and thereby draws millions of families perpetually into his net. Pay him as much as he may, the debtor is always in debt. With no conscience to check him, there is no fraud, and there is no chicanery which he will not commit. His grip over the nation is complete. The whole of the poor, starving, illiterate India is irretrievably mortgaged to the Banya. In every country there is a governing class. No country is free from it. But is there anywhere in the world a governing class with such shellfish, diseased, and dangerous and perverse mentality? With such a hideous and infamous philosophy of life which advocates the trampling down of the servile classes to sustain the power and glory of the governing classes? I know of none. It is true that the governing classes in other countries do not readily admit into their society those who do not belong to their class, but they do not refuse admission to those who have risen to their level, nor do they prevent any person from rising to their level. In India, the governing class is a closed corporation, unwilling to admit anyone who does not belong to it by birth, and ready to use every means to prevent the servile classes from rising to their level. The end.